I'm Rick Munn. This is No Risk, No Reward Media. I'm joined again today by the one and only Ben Pyle. Ben is an independent researcher and writer and a self-proclaimed net zero skeptic. Welcome back, Ben. How are you doing?
Oh, well, thanks, Rick. How's it going?
It's going pretty good. It's going pretty good. My end of the fence. It's not going so good for other people within the UK at the moment. There's a lot of lunacy and insanity taking place at the moment, as people are probably well aware. And I want to zone in on some of that with you today. Someone we discussed the last time that you were on, Ed Miliband, unhinged man at best, complete stark raving lunatic at worst. There's now kickback against his GB Energy plan, scheme, call it what you want, evil, wicked scheme. Ed Miliband's GB Energy slammed as a needless new quango, costing taxpayers £8.3 billion. It's Starmer's idea for a state-owned clean energy company, but of course it's headed up by Ed Miliband. So the Tories are now aghast at the thought of 8.3 billion of taxpayers' money being spaffed away on a needless quango. In the space of 14 years, could they possibly have spaffed the equivalent of 8.3 billion away on pointless quangos, PPE equipment, on and on the list goes?
Well, the term pointless quango is a tautology, in my view. They're pretty much all the quangos are useless, and they're created precisely in order to put more distance between the public and decision making and policy making, because you can't get access to a quango. And I pointed this out a lot. The original quango, the original climate quango, try and say that with a mouthful of quackers. It it was the Climate Change Committee, and that was created by the legislation, the Climate Change Act, that created this panel of experts that were supposed to set a carbon budget. And you can't access that quango. You can't make any representation to them, but they are allowed to give representation to Parliament. Parliament is required to listen to the Climate Change Committee's advice, and indeed the Secretary of State is required to listen to their advice or their recommendations. So the public are kind of excluded from that. They don't have to ask the public, we're going to, what do you think about this carbon budget? This quango does it. So what policymakers don't say is what net zero is going to look like. What it's when you wake up in 2050, what does Britain look like? All of that has been designed by the CCC, which all of the parties, so that's the Climate Change Committee. So all of the parties have agreed it's the Climate Change Committee that should decide what the budgets are. So you can't hold anyone to account. And so when you challenge the CCC, they've just had a chief executive leave called Chris Stark, and he's been replaced by a woman called Emma Pinchbeck, who's a bit of an industry hack. And if you try and challenge them, there's nothing requiring them to answer you. So they can lie with impunity, and they do lie, and we've caught them out in many a lie. And now Chris Stark, who left the CCC, is now another climate quango, which Ed Miliband has set up. I think it's called Clean Energy Mission Control, and then there's GB Energy as well. So what's happened is a kind of metastasis of climate quangos that has been set up. And that's because the original Climate Change Committee has failed in its functions and its purpose. And so the new government has decided that it needs a sort of investment vehicle to help push the agenda. But these are really just sort of bizarre apparatus that a government needs to overcome all of the policy failures that it has overseen or has contributed to, both in office as the previous government, the one before the 14 years of Conservative government, and in opposition. At no point did they stop and say there's something wrong with this agenda. and we can see that there is something wrong with the agenda, because over the last 20 years of, or 24 years of climate policy, the renewables obligation began in the year 2000. We could see over that time that energy prices have gone up 3 times in real terms.
Mm-hmm.
So you're paying 3 times as much as you were in the year 2004 for your power and your gas. Now that is a failure of all of the quangos, including that have been set up, including Ofgem, which is the regulator of the energy sector, and it includes the CCC. So, of course, the answer to a technocrat about to any policy failure is to build another quango. And the Tories' criticism of it is that it's another pointless quango. Remember, this is the party that promised a bonfire of the quangos. It's I think that was under David Cameron. He came in and said, we're going to get rid of all the, I think somebody counted them. There were like 1,500 quangos, these non-statutory public bodies, or some of them are statutory as well. I think that that's to say created by legislation. And he said we were going to get rid of them all, but they discovered they couldn't for whatever reason, or they just sort of like buried that promise away. There's a scene, if you've ever watched that comedy from the 1980s, Yes, Prime Minister,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a scene in which they say they're going to get rid of civil servants. So they got some management consultancy or some civil servants themselves to decide whether or not civil servants were necessary, and how many they could get rid of. And then the civil servant who's responsible for this job says, "Oh, we're going to need 10,000 more civil servants." Mm-hmm. So there is no way power is going to dilute itself. And there's no way a bureaucracy is going to say, well, we've discharged our functions.
Yeah.
We're not necessary anymore. We should be closed down. They're always going to be mission creep. They're always going to be seeking new fiefdoms for themselves. And you look at these profiles of these people; they're all on extremely good money. Chris Stark, for example, I think he was on in excess of over £250,000 a year salary as a civil servant, for example, when he was at the Climate Change Committee. That's just like that's there's no incentive in there to sort of relax, to be less ambitious, and to sort of serve the public interest. It's a very weird political situation that we've got into.
Well, with regards to this, okay, Ashley Fox MP has commented that GB Energy is just another sign of Labour's heavy-handed approach to governing Britain. Rather than unlocking significant sums of private sector cash that's ready to invest in renewables, GB Energy will crowd it out and waste taxpayers' money. So just on that point about heavy-handed approach to governing Britain, is there not an element of, desperate salesman about the whole climate change net zero push at the minute? Whereby, I mean, we've talked about this before. If people want to stick solar panels on the roof, let them. If they want to stick a wind farm up in their garden, let them. If they want to buy an EV and charge it at home or try and let them do it. But don't tell me that I have to get rid of my internal combustion engine car that is pretty bomb-proof, gets me from A to B reliably, with no anxiety on my part, needs a little bit of maintenance here and there, is a pretty clean vehicle anyway. Don't tell me that I have to get rid of that by a certain time, Ed Miliband, because you are thrusting something upon me that I don't want, or a heat pump for that matter, or to have a certain amount of my energy coming from a certain source and pushing my bills up through the roof. Do you not think if they backed off a little bit, if they pushed this forward as a really good thing for us and crucial to our future, but left it that we weren't going to have it thrust down our throats, do you not think they would make a little bit more headway in this one, Ben?
Yeah, certainly. And well, I mean, he's wrong. That criticism is wrong, not just because they are going to be another heavy-handed bureaucracy. He's wrong because there is not a whole load of private investment ready to come and invest in Britain. The government, as it is, and the Tory one and the Labour one before that, they've had to create a completely different economic situation that makes it possible for renewable energy to yield a return on investment. right? And so that was in the from 2000 to about 2014. That was called renewables obligation, and that gave the owner of a wind farm, for example, an extra 50 quid per megawatt hour, 5p a unit or whatever, on top of your bill for every kilowatt hour you use. And that was, and if you look at the debates in Parliament, they were talking about ensuring investor confidence. It was all about investor confidence. So they knew that in order to get someone to pay 10 times over the odds for a wind farm versus a power station, a gas power station, they had to underwrite the profits that green energy companies would get. So that criticism is just misplaced. That, you know, the quango is the wrong answer to it, but he's asking the wrong question. I mean, if there was a company that could produce green power at a market price competitive with gas or coal or oil, it would make no difference to me. Mm-hmm. It would, you know, people often say, "Are you arguing for big oil?" No, I have no interest. You know, it doesn't bother me at all. What's important is we get the energy, we get the electricity, or we get the local reliably and affordably, and it has to be abundant. But all these quangos are necessary, and all these regulations are necessary because it doesn't work. Thermodynamically, it doesn't work. Economically, it doesn't work. It's a fantasy that you have to try and bend reality to in order to furnish this agenda with what it needs to succeed. So they try and bend the economics of energy, guaranteeing people's profits, picking winners, and then the rest of society has to bend around it. And if it's too brittle, it will break, because now we can't afford to drive as much. Now we can't afford to heat our homes as much. So what do? Well, we don't go to the cinema. We don't go to the restaurant. We don't go on the holidays. We don't go on the days out. And then what happens then is all those companies that provide those services, they get closed down. The ones that are on the margin, they go into the red and they can't survive and they close down. And then people don't have jobs. So it's not like, oh, well, it's just more expensive energy, everyone's just going to pay a little bit more money. No, people are going to pay 3 times as much money for a fundamental utility. And no amount of fudging the economics, no amount of new quangos can really address that. So these Tories who are criticizing Labour for this stuff I compare it to a WWF fight. You know, the fake fights, the completely staged managed. They were fun. People enjoyed them for the laugh, and you know they'd get passionate about their favorites. But they were just faked wrestling. And with silly stunts, and you know, it's just spectacle. It's fine. It's a spectacle. It's meant for that. It's entertaining. This is very far from entertaining, but it's just as fake a confrontation between Labour and you know. So you've got these stand-up slanging rows between Claire Coutinho and her opposite, who's Ed Miliband, who's now got her old job, and she's saying, "Oh, this is silly and expensive," and he goes. And she's absolutely right. It is silly and expensive. And Ed Miliband then goes, yeah, but they're your policies. You were doing exactly this. And he's absolutely right. So they're absolutely both right, but they're absolutely both wrong. And we shouldn't indulge that debate. It's not a serious debate. We need to move on.
One word that came up in the last few minutes that we were talking there was reliability. Okay, reliability. And I think that's the big thorn in EVs, electric vehicles, flesh as well. I remember right from the get-go, psychological conditions were springing up around EV ownership. They had things called range anxiety, charging anxiety, the same kind of anxiety people have when they look down at their mobile phone and they say that they're in the red and they think, how am I going to get home? What if my battery dies? I'll not have any internet connectivity. That's transported into their cars. So people like to know that they're topped up. They like to know that they're going to get from A to B, and they want to know that if they have some difficulty between A to B, that there's a solution to that problem. They can dip in somewhere, charge up, and get themselves on home. But no, psychological conditions are coming up in and around this reliability. And the same thing, I mean, that's all people want. I'm the same as you. If all of our power came from solar, if that was feasibly possible and it was clean and cheaper. I don't give a damn if nuclear power never starts, or we're not fracking, or there's no, oil or gas or coal input from this. But the problem is, the reality is, there is no reliability with solar, especially in Britain and especially during the winter months. And let's just talk about that real briefly to give people an idea. So, of the energy that's being generated right this minute being almost the middle of December 2024. I've been looking at the skies over my house for the last 2 days. I haven't seen the sun. I haven't even seen clouds. There's just been this milky white blanket. So the amount of energy that's being generated by solar at the minute, it's pretty much zip. So it doesn't matter if there's fields and fields and acres and hectares of solar panels. If there's no sun, there's no power. And then when a storm comes along, you could think, well, that's good for the wind farms. They'll be generating plenty of electricity. A lot of them had to be shut down because there was too much wind, and then hailstones come along with Storm Darragh, smashing up the solar panels, wrecking these things that maybe if the sun does come out, the panels are all smashed up. And how do you get rid of them in an eco-friendly way anywhere? There's none of that. So hence the skepticism and hence the kickback, I think, that's getting bigger by the day. There's just no reliability. It's a fantasy. It's a net zero fantasy that they're trying to thrust on us, and anyone with a brain in their head can see through it.
Yeah, it is. It does take some digging to understand it, because the mainstream media, which is most people's point of contact for this kind of information, it just isn't really capable of explaining it, and there is no will to explain it either. That is, say, to explain it critically and say this stuff has been a little bit of a mistake. But you're completely right, and it should have been on the front page since the start that if the wind is if there's no wind. And everyone can understand this, I hope. You don't get any electricity from a wind turbine. But then if it's blowing too much, right? If the wind is too strong, then you have to turn it off. And then there's another problem, which is that it might be blowing, but it's producing more electricity than is needed on or that then can be carried, because there are the wires connecting, for example, Scotland to the south of England are only capable of carrying so much power. So it turns out that there are wind farms, particularly offshore wind farms, who make more money because they are paid to not produce electricity. They're paid to sort of turn their blades into the wind so that they don't spin. Or again, whichever way it is, so they make more money not producing electricity. They're called constraint payments than they do from electricity. So this is fundamentally irrational. This is completely bonkers, and that contrasts with, for example, in a coal-fired power station, or more likely at a gas-fired power station. If the demand goes up, you just shove more gas in and more electricity comes out the other end, right? So you don't have this kind of clash. The Greens' answer to this, or the wonks' answer to this, is, well, what we can have is hydrogen production attached to the wind farm, so that when there's too much electricity being produced by the wind turbine, we can produce hydrogen, and then when there's no wind, we can burn it. Well, the problem is that's going to be fantastically expensive. You've now got to pay not just for the wind farm, but you've also got to pay for the hydrogen production plant and the electricity generator. So you've kind of tripled already what you've the amount of money that you've spent, and you've already paid 2 or 3 times more than you need to if you'd have just built a gas plant in the first place. So it's kind of analogous to the way all these policy failures spawn more quangos, more bureaucracy. All of these failures require more technology. The whole thing turns into like a Heath Robinson kind of contraption to try and sort of mitigate the failures of the upstream machinery, and that's bad for everyone. It's costing a fortune.
Well, it is costing a fortune, and like I say, even if this was viable and this worked and it was consistent and it did have some element of reliability there, you have to protect your investment per se. And this article And I mean, like, I'm surprised at the language here used by the Daily Mail in this one, and forgive me for quoting the Daily Mail, but reference this wind farm that was ripped to pieces, in their words, by
Mm.
Storm Darragh. The cost of killer Storm Darragh, sorry, killer Storm Darragh. Recovery work went
Right.
on Monday. Hundreds of panels at the giant 190-acre Porth when solar farm in Anglesey, North Wales, it was only built 2 years ago, were blown off their mountings, and some were, quote, ripped to shreds. Ripped to shreds, solar panel, well, whatever. The site at Landabrig, forgive my pronunciation, in the north end of the island, owned by French power firm EDF Energy, and powers up to 9,500 households, now needs significant repairs. Elsewhere on the island of Anglesey, blades were sheared off
All right.
a wind turbine, which then reportedly caught fire. So, when you start to get certain publications that would have been very pro, net zero and pro environmental love, starting to use language like ripped off, ripped to shreds, sheared off, catching fire, killer storm. All of a sudden, you're thinking, is the worm turning when the meal's coming out with stuff like that? Is the worm beginning to turn?
They've always blown hot and cold, I think, on climate and the green stuff. They ran a very silly campaign on banning the plastic bags. And they had like a very emotional pictures of little tortoises swimming amongst plastic bags. I think one of them may have been faked, but don't quote me. I don't want to libel them. But it was they kind of try and play both sides in a sense, and they'll talk about climate hypocrisy and stuff. But I've tracked them less closely than I used to. But the idea that I mean that what it really says to me is there's always the Greens want to tell you that there's such a thing as friendly weather. And you'll probably know it far better than me up there in in Northern Ireland, overlooking with I think you told me Scotland on the other side of the water.
Mm-hmm.
You know full well weather isn't your mate.
Mm-hmm.
Right, you'll enjoy the weather every now and then, and I used to when I lived by the seaside, I used to love the storms. I used to walk along the cliff tops, a little bit from the edge, but it's beautifully dramatic but it's not helping anyone, right? It's not helping anyone farm, and it's not helping anyone get to work. We exist in spite of the weather in many respects, but there's this green fantasy that we can have this harmonious relationship in balance with nature and the weather. But actually, what we've discovered is that the weather is, like most of nature, wants to kill you and eat you.
Yeah.
And look, we've got weather dependent energy now, and the weather has destroyed the weather dependent energy infrastructure. It's come and ripped up a solar farm, and it's ripped up
Wind.
a wind farm, and that is perfectly that captures it perfectly. We're trying to make friends with a vicious, untamable beast, and we understood that. That's the tragedy of it. We understood that in the past. We understood that nature had to be kind of not found an accommodation with. We had to find a way of resisting it and mitigating it, and so. Rather than living in the fantasy world where we can be its mate,
Control it, or its
yeah,
master. You can't do it. Speaking of which, just want to move on to another subject before we wrap this one up here. Yesterday was a very significant day in London. There was another farmers' protest that was taking place in there. From what I can see, there was a lot more interest in this one. It was a lot bigger. The scale was a lot bigger. There was a lot more vehicles involved in this one. And the one of the posts that I'm looking at here was this is directed at Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. You better be listening. Hundreds of farmers driving through
yeah.
London. Incredible scenes. The question is, will they listen? Because we've had the backdrop since the last time you and I spoke a few weeks ago of the Bovaer food additive
Mm.
shenanigans with Arla Foods in conjunction with various supermarkets. There's been a massive backlash against that. A lot of people boycotting products. But the government's response to that was, well, actually, by 2030, we want to have every single cow in England eating products with Bovier added in. So it's not a case of, well, the public have spoken and we have listened. It's like the public have spoken, we don't like what they've said, and we're going to double down on our position even more over the next 5 years. Do you think this may be the same with these farmer protests? It's like, there they are again. They're clogging up traffic. They're being a nuisance. We're not budging on this one because they haven't budged on anything so far. How much further can these farmers go, or will they have to get to the point where they say, you know what, we're going to withhold food, or we're going to cause blockages to ports, or we're going to stop supplying supermarkets? Well, is that what it'll take to get people to sit up and listen in the corridors of power?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, or multi-billion-pound question. I keep meaning to go to the supermarket and have a look at the butter shelves, but I've been trying to avoid supermarkets recently.
Yeah, me too.
But I want to go and see what the Arla products, whether they've got these price reduction labels on that. I've seen a few people tweet. That would be fantastic if it does. But you're right. Like there isn't a problem that people have raised to which the answer from government hasn't been doubling down. And that, I mean, I've been arguing this for quite a long time, that the net zero agenda requires a civil confrontation. Not like I don't want a civil confrontation. It seems to have a confrontation, a deep social crisis embedded into its future. And so when the net zero was first mooted by the likes of Extinction Rebellion, they were demanding net zero by 2025, which is just days away now. But that was in like 2018, 2019, and I said the only precedent for this in history, in which such wealth has been destroyed and society has been so comprehensively reorganized in such a small amount of time, has happened at the end, with troops on streets pointing guns at citizens, not against armed uprising. Like this is civil war land, right? So by extending the deadline of net zero out to 2025, unless you've got a very clear idea about how it's technologically and economically feasible (brackets it isn't), then you only mitigate that or ameliorate that problem, that confrontation, to some degree. And so the last government was beginning to get it, and I think perhaps the Tories now understand that it was a mistake, but they did not have the means to do more than the smallest of U-turns. So the two U-turns the Sunak government made was it sort of deferred, it moved the deadline for the abolition of petrol and diesel cars from 2030, as was its intention, to 2035, and then it softened the ban on domestic gas boilers. And so that was the lesson it learnt at the 14 years. And unfortunately, it learnt that lesson far, far, far too late. So, realised the net zero agenda is unworkable and people don't want it. And that even if there wasn't a broad public conversation about this era, it was just a sort of a small constituency, as it were, of people who were talking about it. It had no means to do a proper U-turn and say, we're not doing net zero anymore. It was a terrible mistake. And unfortunately, no one was going to vote for that government again because of all of the other errors that it made and all of the good faith and the trust that it had lost from the public. So we would get, on the basis of just a fifth of the electorate's votes, we get the Labour Party, who mistake their election for a coronation, and they're full of all of the vim that they had when in 2010, when they last lost it. So it was like, oh, now we just carry on, as though nothing had happened in the 14 years. So they've got to learn that lesson again before if they're even capable of it. And there's got to be the arguments in readiness for a net zero withdrawal, not just because we're practically in policy terms, and people making business plans, factories deciding what they're going to be doing 5 or 10 years into the future, that they start thinking about this now. Their order books are 5 years ahead. They've got to start planning for this now. So all of the chaos is going to start ramping up now.
Yeah.
So I think we're headed for a deeper crisis. I think they will work it out. They'll have to follow it, because the reality was the last Conservative government it was ultimately confronted with reality, but they still haven't worked out how deep the crisis is either. So Labour have got a lot to learn.
Yeah, they sure have a lot to learn, and that's just one particular area that we're talking about as well. Of a lot to
One,
learn
yeah,
about a lot
yeah,
of things. I
yeah.
think we'll finish this off, and I suppose let's finish it off on a high note. The one thing that we are seeing is the wheels do seem to be coming off the whole
Mm.
net zero vehicle. You know, the COP29 was a pretty much a flop. We talked about that a few weeks ago. You know, there's a lot of kickback against this. The sales of EVs are terrible. You know, the government are pushing, oh, they're doing very well, but they're fleet sales that are heavily subsidized in the first place. The unreliability, people are becoming acutely aware of it. Nobody's escaping the higher energy prices. This is a fact. And yeah, these are things that we're seeing. And the kickback to the Bovier food additives, it's
Yeah.
people voting with their wallets, they're voting with their feet. And now bigger protests are springing up more frequently and gathering in intensity. That can only be an indicator that people are not happy, they're disgruntled, and they're making their feelings known. So, no doubt, as time rolls on and the weeks pass and the months pass, as we continue to cover this, we'll start to see more kickbacks and more evidences that these things will fall by the wayside. So in the meantime, if you've enjoyed this interview, which I hope you have, please feel free to subscribe to the channel. Share it. That's the most important thing. Cut and paste the link, stick it into Facebook groups, stick it into WhatsApp groups, stick it wherever you like, but just share the content, please, and let people be aware of what's happening. And in the description box underneath the video, there'll be all the links to Ben's output. He's got a website. He's got a fantastic Substack page. Please subscribe to him and support him on that. And he also has a great social media presence on X or Twitter. Give him a follow on there. Show him some love on there. And in the meantime, from Ben Pyle and from me, Rick Munn, this is No Risk, No Reward Media, over and out.